Hi, hello everyone. Please be seated. There are still places here in the first row. You don't have to be shy. Okay? Okay. Okay, so first of all, welcome to FLAD. My name is Rita Faden. I'm FLAD's president, and it's an honor to have you here and to receive you at FLAD. This is the fourth session in our series, Democracy, the Way Ahead, where we have been discussing the challenges and the current problems that our democracies, the liberal democracy that we consider that we live in, is facing, not only in Europe, but also in the United States. And we have been discussing this from various points of view. And today we bring a new perspective, a more geopolitical perspective, with Robert Kaplan, who I thank you very much for his presence. And it's, please sit. Sorry. And we are very pleased to have you all here. Robert D. Kaplan is a best-selling author and a leading thinker in foreign affairs with vast experience as foreign correspondent. He holds a chair in geopolitics at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and is senior advisor at Eurasia Group. As I was saying, we have talked about the current state of global affairs here with a particular focus on Russia and China. But one thing that the Russian invasion of Ukraine have reminded us all is the importance of geopolitics. That is, it is crucial to understand the place where we are in the world, and it is crucial to understand that to our discussion on the future of democracy. And I can attest to that. In my previous life in government, I worked for many years in international relations, and I see here many colleagues that worked in previous lives, but also that are still working. And I always had a huge world map in the wall facing me. And my first instinct was always look at the map. Whenever we had a problem, whenever we had an issue with any country, my first instinct was always look at the map. And it's crucial to understand where that concrete country is. Who are the neighbors? Do they have access to the sea? They don't have direct access to the sea. How can they have? Do they have rivers that go to the sea? What are the ports? What are beyond the neighbors? What are the dangers that they face in that neighborhood? What are the routes, the traffic routes that pass through that region? If you look at the map, you understand at least half the problem and half the situation of a given country. I've always believed this, and it has always helped me in my previous life. So for me, it's a huge honor to have someone here that espouses the same approach, and to talk to us about the importance of geopolitics. Of course, we needed to have also Miguel Monjardino with us to help us to guide the conversation, and I'm sure we are here all to hear you both. So welcome, and please, the floor is yours, Robert Kaplan and Miguel Monjardino. Thank you so much.
Right. Let me explain what we're going to try to do. We'll try to set the scene with 15, 20 minutes conversation between us, and then, since there's a lot of young people and very experienced people here, we will open the floor to debate, okay? I must start with a confession. This is Robert Kaplan's favorite book for me. In Europe's Shadow, Two Cold Wars and a 30-Year Journey through Romania and beyond. I think it's, the way I see it, your more personal book. So it's been 40 years since you started your illustrious career. So the question, particularly because there are lots of young students here, is how did you start your career? Because as you write in the book, your beginnings were not very promising in terms of...
No. I was 29 years old. I had traveled for years through the Middle East, hadn't published almost anything, and was without any prospects. And at 29, I bought a one-way ticket from Israel to Romania. And in Romania, at the time, this was 1981, 42 years ago, Romania was under the strictest Stalinist system that Europe had known, with the exception of Albania and Stalin himself. This was the rule of Nicolae Ceausescu. And suddenly, I was in Romania, and I realized a number of things in the first days there, that the Middle East was interesting and important, but it was not the center stage for history at the time. The center stage was the Cold War, and this was ground zero for the Cold War. This was a population which normally should have been fairly prosperous, which had been pulverized and driven into deep poverty and repression by an ideology. And also I realized that I had no stake in Romania. Whether it got worse or better, it didn't affect me or my family or my friends in any way at all. So that allowed me to be analytical about Romania, to kind of to cover it without any emotions at all. And that's how I discovered this is what I want to do. I want to go to places where I have no stake, where I can just write analytically about them, what's going on. And Romania started an odyssey that, a few years later, about 7 years later, led to my first book on the Ethiopian famine. And that book led to a book about the war, the Soviet war in Afghanistan, and on, for the next few decades with different books. And I eventually started writing for the Atlantic magazine for 30 years. But you cannot do that today.
Yes.
Because then there was no Google. And because there was no Google, and it was a print economy, I could sell the same story 5 or 6 times over to different markets. And to sell a story 5, 6 times over and do several stories a month, I could make a really good living as a freelancer. A really sustainable living, and even to save money. You cannot do this today, where once you have a piece that's on Google, you cannot touch it again.
Okay. We'll get back to this issue of technology and journalism.
Yeah.
When you spoke about being analytical and your personal odyssey, you develop a very unique style, or your books have a unique style, because you basically worked as a reporter going to the field. It's obvious you've read a lot in terms of the classics of political thought, and there's also lots of literature. How did you develop this way of looking at the world? How did you have the idea that this was the best framework to look at what's going on in the world?
It was unconscious. I just love to read. I discovered the Greek classics while I lived in Greece in the 1980s. This was after Romania. And I discovered the great classics of political science, Hans Morgenthau, and et cetera, later on when I started to write about international affairs, and people would say, you should read this and you should read that. So I became a very avid reader of good stuff, of the classics. And also, I never made a distinction between travel writing, describing a place, and geopolitical analysis. To me, geopolitical analysis, you had to get on the ground and describe things, how they were. So, nowadays, everyone's a specialist. Everyone's mining a tunnel, so to speak. And, but for me, I eventually evolved into a generalist. And there are fewer and fewer generalists today.
Oh, I certainly will agree with that. And there are a few professors of international politics here that probably will also agree with you too. So we're in defense of generalists in international politics. One of the things that you emphasize in certain books is the tragic dimension of international politics. This is something that, at least in universities, going back to universities, we seem to have lost this tragic dimension.
Yeah.
It's all about human agency. There is no, this tragic dimension is absent, either in the policy-making world or in op-ed pieces that most people write. Why do you think this is so?
I think it's they've lost track of the ancient Greeks, because the Greeks define tragedy differently than we do. For us, tragedy is common misfortune. Common misfortune is the rule of life. Mistakes are the rule of life. That's not what the Greeks meant about tragedy. Tragedy is not good versus evil, with evil winning, because that's an easy choice, defend the good. Tragedy is about making a decision with 30% of the evidence, because by the time there's 40%, it's too late to affect the outcome. Tragedy is about one good supplanting another good that leads to suffering. And people in power deal with this all the time. They have options put in front of them. And all of the options may be good in one fashion or another. But by choosing one option over the other, someone's going to have to suffer. You know, that's what the Greeks and Hegel, who interpreted the Greeks, really honed in on. You know, that it's the actual binary choices of leadership with only 30% of the evidence that leads, even if it's a successful policy, to a certain level of tragedy. And the Greeks accepted that and said at the same time the world is beautiful, because they could imagine an imperfect universe.
When you speak about the decision-making process, in a way decision makers have to act quickly because there's a certain urgency. But as you said, you only know about 30% of the problem. Do you have any advice of what people should read to prepare themselves for such a world, and where you have to decide under a lot of pressure and you don't have a full picture of what's really going on?
Yeah, the biggest advice I would offer is to be fearful, to respect fear, to be fearful, but don't let yourself be overcome by fear. You know, have just enough fear without having fear itself become the adversary, so to speak. It's about husbanding fear without being overwhelmed by it. And it's a trick. You know, it's a hard sensibility to follow. Clearly, the best example in a negative sense of this is Munich in 1938. Because you had a British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, who only 20 years before, 17 million people were killed in World War I. And all of Hitler's crimes were in the future. He didn't know about them. He couldn't have known about them. So he decided, no way we're getting into another war, whatever the outcome. And it turned out to be a difficult, wrong decision, because he let fear get ahead of him. He put too much into fear. This is very imperfect advice, I know, but it's the only advice I could give.
Yes. You mentioned good stuff, the good stuff you have read. Can you recommend some good stuff?
I think one of the best books that I've read that has stayed with me over the course of the decades is Henry Kissinger's first book, written when he was in his mid-20s, when he didn't have assistants or researchers and was just a poor student at Harvard. And it was a book called A World Restored, Metternich, Castlereagh, and the Problems of Peace. And this was the height of the Cold War. People were talking about thermonuclear annihilation with hydrogen bombs. And he writes a book about 19th century Austrian statesmanship. And his professor said, what does this have to do with anything? And at 26, he was already a genius. Whatever his mistakes in the future, he was already a genius. And he said it has everything to do with it, because it has to do with erecting a new order after the Napoleonic Wars, not on idealism, but on pragmatism and realism. And, and his basic conclusion was that Metternich and Castlereagh and Talleyrand, who were all cold fish with not a blood of warmth in their body, erected a cold system that, because it was built on realism, kept the peace in Europe for decades, for so long that when World War I began, people had lost the sense of the tragic, and they stumbled into an awful war because they had taken for granted the century of peace that these cold fish pragmatists had granted them. And the other great book is The Federalist Papers by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, which was about, Americans have been, until recently, optimists. But why are they optimists? Because their republic was founded by pessimists. All of these people were pessimists. All they did was worry about what could go wrong. And because they worried so much and considered everything that could go wrong, less went wrong than normally would have. And it provided a system where people could get wealthy and be at peace.
We'll get back to the cold fish of the 19th century. There's a lot of, if you look at the press in Europe, or in the United States probably too, there's this huge debate about geopolitics on one hand and human agency about what's going on in Ukraine. What's your view on that? I mean, this contest between geopolitics and human agency?
Well, I wrote The Revenge of Geography over a decade ago because I felt all the emphasis was on human agency. All the emphasis is on is if we can only marshal the moral force, we could overcome everything or anything. And I said to myself, that's nonsense. That's only 50% of reality. The other 50% is the map and the body of knowledge that grows out from the map. Which country have rivers and oceans, which don't, which have mountains and which don't, which have natural resources and which don't, who are your neighbors, et cetera, et cetera. This provides the stage set for geopolitics. And on stage are Shakespearean actors with all of their demons and illusions and all of this. So I decided everyone's concentrating on the Shakespearean stage set. I'll write a book about the other 50%, about geography and how it is still very relevant. And if you look at the war in Ukraine, what is the stage set? Two countries with similar languages, similar intertwined histories, similar cultures, if distinct, and no natural borders between them, just a flat artificial line on the map. And that's the stage set. But on the stage set, you have a Shakespearean character like Vladimir Putin, who makes a decision after being semi-isolated by COVID, where he's spoken and seen much less people than normally, and and there's a sense of loneliness and echo chamber and all of that. And he makes a decision that even much of the Russian elite doesn't agree with, because they don't want a war with the West. They don't want to lose their yachts and all their apartments in London and all of this. The whole Russian elite had big investments in the West. They didn't want to risk this. But here is this Shakespearean character making a decision on 30% of the evidence that he could conquer Ukraine very quickly.
Going back to something you just said about geography, and the president of the foundation also said the importance of always looking at the map. In the 19th century, geography was the queen of sciences in a way.
Yes.
Everyone, this broad vision of geography.
Yeah.
Why do you think that nowadays geography is considered irrelevant?
I think geography has been overtaken by political science. Geography in the 19th century sense of the word meant the beginning of knowledge, not the end of knowledge. You started with the map, and then you went to to who lived on the map and what were the characteristics of people living on that part of the map for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And then you got to natural resources, to topography, to all of that. And that was gradually overtaken in the course of the 20th century by political science. And political science had a number of assumptions, that the world, if not perfect, could become more perfectible if only we studied it and made the right decisions. And it was also based on the assumption that politics could aspire to be a science. And what does it mean to be a science? That it's predictable, or more predictable than we think. So it's an aspirational term. And it took, I think, it didn't take policymakers away from reality, because as someone said, the minute you put a laminated badge around your neck in the Pentagon or the White House, you're a realist, whatever you may have called yourself beforehand, because you deal with crises that humble you, that can destroy your reputation, and half of it will be luck, good luck or bad luck, no matter what decisions you make. So I think, the science of politics overtook the reality of the Earth and its spatial components. And I think we've lost something in the transition.
Mm. You spoke of Mr. Putin as a Shakespearean figure. The way I read him, he deeply believes that this war against Ukraine will strengthen Russia. You've written about the Caucasus and Central Asia.
Yeah.
And how do you see this war, affecting Russia's interests and presence in the Caucasus and Central Asia?
I think it's been a disaster. And it's been a disaster because the longer the war in Ukraine goes on, the less financial, economic, and military power Russia has to affect outcomes in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, and to maintain its always tenuous hold over Siberia and the Russian Far East. So I think this is an empire-destroying war, because not only would the Russian Empire cease if it lost Ukraine completely, but Russia's ability to control the rest of the empire would also be damaged. So I think Putin invaded Ukraine with the assumption it would be a relatively quick victory. He's lost that war. That war is over. He's lost it. He had to reinvent the war in different terms to stay in power. And he's reinvented it as a war of survival against the collective West.
So, how do you explain, if it is possible to explain, that a man who worked in secret services and who was supposed to know Ukraine quite well and had an intelligence apparatus supporting him, if there was a country that Russia should know very well, it was Ukraine. How do you explain such a failure in terms of analysis?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I would argue that Putin was the opposite of Hitler. Hitler told everyone in 1922 what he wanted to do in his book Mein Kampf. Hitler never evolved. He reached a point after World War I and stayed the same. The difference was he just got power and was able to actuate what he wanted to do. I think Putin evolved. He came back as a disgruntled KGB agent who thought that the power structure had deserted the KGB, had let the empire fall apart, began to work his way up the ladder in very messy, corrupt, but at the end of the day, democratic administrations under Boris Yeltsin, and became someone who could get things done, who could bureaucratically get things done as a result of his KGB experience. He was also loyal to his superiors, and they valued that loyalty. That's why Yeltsin always promoted him. And when he came into power, he toyed around with liberalism, making the Russian system more liberal, more open, but he quickly retreated. because that was more risky than actually retreating into authoritarianism. You know, liberalism always entices dictators at the beginning. It enticed Bashar al-Assad when he first took power, but he quickly retreated because that was even more risky than to stay an authoritarian. So I think Putin evolved, and when he got power, he used intelligence operations to build his power. And the war in Chechnya helped him build his power. And I think, and then the longer he stayed in power, the more isolated he became. And then finally there was COVID-19, which isolated him even further in terms of the people he met in the course of a day, the people who would give him advice in the course of the day. So, and he was also became more and more of a Russian nationalist in the course of these 20 years. So I think it was a gradual process where he ended up making a binary decision based on too little evidence that has proved disastrous.
Mm. How do you see, diplomatically speaking, how do you assess the Biden administration's response?
I think look, it's the nature of journalism to always criticize and to always find fault. But I think that overall, the Biden administration so far has handled the war in Ukraine rather well. I think it's been the most impressive display of the use of American power since the first Gulf War of 1991, where the elder Bush administration with James Baker and Brent Scowcroft essentially ejected Iraq from Kuwait and got the Arab Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia to pay the complete bill of it with very little loss of American life. I think the Biden administration has poured tens of billions of dollars into Ukraine. They've had big debates in the Pentagon about every weapon system, and that's why people are frustrated that they haven't done more quicker. But this is the Pentagon process. They were thinking tragically. They didn't want to make mistakes. They didn't want the war to spread to NATO. They didn't want the use of weapons of mass destruction. So they proceeded methodically. And as it becomes less likely that Putin will use weapons of mass destruction, they've sent more weapons. The Biden administration has. And I think it's been a great use of the intelligence services. You know, it's been quite revolutionary where the head of the CIA tells people publicly what the CIA has. The Russians will invade, here's what they have. Nobody thought that was possible, that you could use intelligence services to the aim of public policy, so to speak. So I think overall, it's been a good performance. I would only criticize one major aspect of it. They should not have framed the war as democracy versus autocracy, because it's really a war of basic global order. You know, a major country should not be allowed to massively invade another country and blow up apartment buildings and schools and all of that. By limiting it, by saying it's democracy versus autocracy, they've essentially alienated a lot of would-be American allies in Southeast Asia and in other places who would normally have gone along with the war. They've made it too exclusive a club by this, I believe, overemphasis on democracy.
You've been around for a very long time, and very senior officials have consulted with you. What can I ask you, which Secretary of State, American, impressed you most?
In my career?
Yes.
James Baker. Because Kissinger was before I was a reporter. I think James Baker was the last consequential Secretary of State in American history. Everyone who succeeded him was not nearly up to his level. You know, he essentially negotiated the outcome of the end of the Cold War, bringing Eastern Germany into NATO, laying the groundwork for an expansion of NATO. And had NATO never expanded, by the way, we would now be fighting for Poland, not for Ukraine. He negotiated a coalition of, I think it was about 35 countries to oppose Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. He essentially, along with Brent Scowcroft, punished China for Tiananmen Square, but crucially did not break relations with China. And if you think that all of the economic progress for the average Chinese, most of it, that was made after Tiananmen, not before Tiananmen, I think Baker has a real consequential legacy. He was not interesting, like Kissinger is interesting. He was not an intellectual. He was more of a lawyerly deal maker type, but I think very, very consequential.
Do you see anyone in the United States today being able to perform a similar role?
Yes, I do. I think Bill Burns, this head of the CIA, is miscast. He should be the Secretary of State. Bill Burns is like a throwback to the wise men, to George Kennan and people like that. He has this infinite ability in 9 out of 10 circumstances to have the right judgment on an event. He has enormous diplomatic experience both in the Arab world and in Russia. I think, and he could yet be Secretary of State if there were to be a second Biden administration.
I think it's the third time you use the word judgment, which is a very interesting word. How do diplomats and senior decision makers acquire judgment, that rare quality?
Sometimes I think that there's a gene for judgment, because it's so indefinable, so to speak. Remember, Machiavelli would say, I can teach you, my prince, all about virtue, which is judgment. But that's only 50% of it. The other 50% is fortuna, luck, With all the judgment in the world, you need luck, as well. And I think the Biden administration has gotten very lucky with the Ukraine war because it provided an opportunity, and this was post-Afghanistan. I think Afghanistan had an ironic effect. It made the Biden administration perform better afterwards, and it fooled Putin into assuming that the West had no gas left, that the West was finished. But I think that, for instance, so far, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, has shown great judgment in this war, in a very complex situation that involves not just military, but diplomatic, in expanding NATO, in sanctions, which gets real technical and economic. I think he's performed with a high degree of judgment.
Have you been surprised by the European reaction of Russia's invasion to Ukraine?
Well, yes, I have been. I think the Germans officially have made a turnaround. But when you look at the numbers and what they're really sending Ukraine and and what they're really doing, it's less impressive, behind the scenes. But I think Finland joining NATO, Sweden wanting to join NATO, even right-wing Italy going against Putin, I think that the Europeans has been a surprise.
Let me be a bit provocative. Do you think Mr. Putin saved NATO by invading Ukraine?
You could make that argument. Because, look, after all, alliances are historical operations. They depend on what their adversary is. NATO was very strong during the Cold War because it had an obvious adversary, the Soviet Union. It got progressively weaker in the 90s and 2010s when there was no obvious adversary and they got involved in Afghanistan, which brought no honor to anyone or no great respect to anyone. And now with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, NATO suddenly has a new purpose, which is close to its original purpose, about guarding against what's to the east.
We will have a NATO summit in Vilnius next week, speaking about geography and history. That's a very pointed choice by NATO. And there are huge debates going on in NATO, and very important decisions will have to be made in the next few weeks. Do you think Ukraine should be included in NATO in the years ahead?
Look, emotionally, it seems now that Ukraine should be brought into NATO and the EU. But if you look ahead 5 years, you're bringing in a country of 44 million people, weakly institutionalized, high level of corruption. And this will be very hard for NATO and the EU to swallow. Remember, NATO, not so much NATO, but the EU had tremendous challenges originally in bringing in Greece, Portugal, and Spain, and then even greater challenges in bringing in countries like Poland and Romania, etc. Ukraine is on a scale of magnitude much greater than any of these countries demographically, etc. So it's the politics is often driven by emotion and the emotions of the moment. And as you said, holding the fact that the next summit is in Vilnius, in Lithuania, a border state with Russia, where anti-Russian feelings are so high, it will add an impetus to bringing Ukraine into NATO. But I'm not sure how good the decision will look half a decade ahead.
So what would you suggest that the Europeans, the Americans, and the Canadians should do?
I think they should put Ukraine on a path for joining NATO and the EU. But that path has test marks along the way, things that they need to achieve. And it's more challenging in the case of the European Union than it is in the case of NATO, because NATO is a military alliance. Whereas the European Union is about how much fat you could put in your yogurt in the morning. It gets into every aspect of economics and decision-making and institutions. So joining the EU is much more challenging. That's why I think we have some members in the Balkans, Montenegro and Albania, which are in NATO, but they're not in the EU.
Your next book will be about the Middle East, the greater Middle East, which seems to be a region where superpowers go to squander resources, time, and energy. And it was very interesting to read about Mahmoud Abbas' recent trip to Beijing and the Palestinian Authority asking, China to step in. This will be a very different Middle East. You've been reporting about it.
Yeah, I've been reporting on the Middle East the last few years. In fact, during COVID, I was traveling back and forth to the Middle East and going crazy with nerves every time I had to take a COVID test before boarding a plane to fly home. Please don't make me positive, and I was lucky. There's a number of quick things about the Middle East. First of all, China is involved in a deep extent, and not just in Iran and Saudi Arabia, but in Egypt, in the Arabian Gulf countries. As one Saudi said to me, the Chinese come with their money, with their desire to buy more and more oil and gas, and they don't give us lectures about democracy the way you Americans do. And that's very refreshing. This is what the Saudis say. And so China is one element. The other element is we've come to believe that the Middle East has no hope because the Arab Spring failed in so many countries. It's even in Tunisia, it's failed for the time being, in Yemen, in Libya, in Syria, in Egypt. But I take a more optimistic note in this book, which is progress is not linear. It doesn't happen in a straight line. And it doesn't happen in the direction that the West wants it to go, by the means that the West wants. The West believes you have to be democratic to have progress. Well, maybe not. I see more and more technological Western, Chinese influence in the Middle East. The Middle East is being sucked into a global system. And the real battle in the Middle East is not between democracy and autocracy. It's between making Middle Eastern regimes like Morocco, Oman, Jordan, more consultative. You know, even if they're a dictatorship, to consult more with various groups in society before making decisions. You know, making the Egyptian regime more consultative. In other words, the path of progress may lie in gradually opening up dictatorships rather than in, you know, in demanding, you know, immediate elections.
Okay, so I think we can move to Q&A. Robert Kaplan, the last time you were in mainland Portugal was 33 years ago. So for those present, I don't know when you're coming back, so I would like to encourage you to ask all the questions that you may have in mind. And let's have a go. Yes, in the back, I think the mic is coming. The mic is coming, yes. Please just state your name and a brief question, please.
Thank you. My name is José Salgado. I have a very brief question, which is, I agree with you, the perspective, the tragic perspective and the realist perspective, but my question, is that perspective helping to destroy the multinational institutions, the multilateral institutions which you have today? And if so, will we miss them, the institutions, that is?
Yeah, look, the multinational institutions have not been able to prevent a war in Ukraine or to have any influence in it whatsoever. You know, nations still operate on the basis of self-interest. And we've seen, and they operate in a sense of balance of power in each region. And I think the forces, for instance, Libya fell apart because it was never a real country. The western part gravitated towards Tunisia, the eastern part gravitated towards Egypt. There are great geographical self-interested forces that kind of, you know, that are more important than multinational institutions, though it's multinational institutions that get all the news, so to speak. I think realism will invigorate multinational institutions. It will make them more pragmatic. I think, and realism will, which is what is practiced in the halls of government in most countries, you know, will be less likely to make misjudgments. And with less misjudgments, there is therefore a more peaceful world where multinational institutions can have more of an effect. So I don't see realism as opposed to multinational institutions. I see it as alongside.
Okay. Isabel? Yes. Isabel? Isabel.
Thank you. If I followed you correctly, my name is Isabel Nunes, National Defense Institute. If I followed you correctly, you have mentioned that political science has in a way changed the territorial perspective on which geography is based. And I would like to know your opinion on how much digitalization, which have changed so much, how do we connect, how do we analyze, how do we decide, how much digitalization will impact on the new geopolitics in the world in permanent crisis?
I think digitalization is one of the forces that is making the world more connected. There's a sense of connectedness that didn't exist before. There is also, it makes the world more claustrophobic, more anxious, more prone to emotion, because social media favors the extremes, whereas the print and typewriter age favored the center. And democracies tend to perform better in the center than in the extremes. So digitalization will weaken the effect of geography, obviously, but it will not eliminate the effect. It will make geography more subtle.
Okay. And then, yes. Yes, segunda fila.
My name is Rui Vinhas. Thank you for the presentation, and I have learned a new definition of what the EU is about, the yogurt sing. Thank you very much. Two brief questions. The first is, in a recent book, you argue that we must learn to think tragically, to avoid tragedy. It's a quite dramatic sentence. If you could elaborate a little bit on that. And the second, I think you arrived a bit late, but I think you didn't mention China. And there was that old and very famous sentence of Brzezinski saying the worst scenario, strategic scenario for the US was an alliance between Russia and China. The US has been able to avoid that for 3 or 4 decades, but now they are quite close and allied. So if you could also elaborate on that, if you, what's your opinion, your views about it? Thank you.
Yes, in a recent book I wrote that you have to think tragically in order to avoid tragedy, which means, to lay out the sentence, it means thinking in terms of worst case scenarios to prevent them from happening. Because in life, like in foreign policy, we tend to worry about what could go wrong. And because we worry about it, we take actions against it or try to. And then things still go wrong, but different things. You know, different things. That's why we're always surprised. So that's what I meant, to cultivate constructive pessimism, as I would put it. To cultivate fear without being overwhelmed by fear. China and Russia historically have not been natural allies. They have a long border of thousands of miles where there has frequently been disputes over. China and Russia almost came to a war in the late 1960s, and it was because the possibility of that war that allowed for Nixon and Kissinger's opening to China in the early 1970s. It was to exploit the fear that both China and Russia had over each other. Now China and Russia are closer than at any time in recent history, mostly in China's favor, because the Ukraine war has weakened Russia so that China can drive a harder bargain for prices on natural gas coming through pipelines from Russia. So that China, because and related to the Ukraine war, is becoming more than just an Asian power. It's becoming a Eurasian power, with Russia as the little brother, so to speak. And this is a variation of Brzezinski's fear. I think, but however, I would also argue that Russia is a steeply declining power, partly because of the Ukraine war, and China is a modestly declining power because Xi Jinping has oriented the system towards hardcore Marxist-Leninism. And when you have hardcore ideologues making strictly financial decisions in the economy, it leads to more mistakes, and that leads to problems. So I think China was on the path to it being accepted and to being an overwhelming power over during Deng Xiaoping, and the men who succeeded him, like Jiang Zemin and Zhu Ronji and Hu Jintao and others. But I think that Xi, though becoming more aggressive, has actually in the long run weakened China.
Jaime? Okay.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to make a very quick question. I don't know if you know Martin Wolf, that is a well-known journalist from Financial Times.
Yeah.
He wrote a recent book about the crisis of democratic capitalism. I think it's one of his best books. And he made an interview very recently with Larry Diamond, that also teaches in our university here in Lisbon. And he says, Larry Diamond and also Martin Wolf, that in order to try to solve the crisis of democratic capitalism, we will need a new social contract, and especially a new smart multilateralism. What do you think about that? Do you agree? What do you think?
Yeah, I generally agree. I'm no economist, but I think one of the great risks to democracy is leaving out significant sections of society. I mean, because that's what gave birth to the Trump phenomenon in the first place. You know, the origins of the Trump phenomenon was that China was able to manipulate the international trading system so that fewer manufacturing jobs were created in precisely the states that Trump carried in the 2016 election. It wasn't the Iraq War, it wasn't the border with Mexico, it was that fewer good jobs were being created for about 20 years after China joined the WTO. That was the main effect. And that's the same thing Martin Wolf and you were talking about. It's about a social contract. There's always a danger of elites making the system better for themselves. Even if they're idealistic, even if they mean well, they make a system better for themselves, but not for people on the lower levels. I remember in Washington about 2015, everyone was talking about we need a free trade pact with the Pacific. And that's true, we did. But they were elites and they were benefiting from free trade, while a lot of the free trade agreements made up until that point did significant damage to the working classes and lower middle classes. They weren't good trade agreements. And that's an example of why we need, why needing a new social contract to bring more people have a stake in the system.
So we'll go to the middle of the room, to the younger generation, then Felipe, and then Mr. Redmond, I think, wants to ask a question. Aqui no meio, braço no ar. Yeah.
Hello, nice to meet you. Thank you for your presentation. My question is regarding the Pacific region. We all know that US changed a little bit their strategic priorities, like the recent partnership with Australia, and the commitment made with Philippines regarding China. Do you think that US Navy has the necessary strength to face an eventual conflict in Taiwan, having regard to other crucial scenarios and crises? Thank you very much.
Yeah, all right. The US Navy traditionally has been oriented towards the Pacific, because the Pacific is a maritime sphere. The Army has traditionally been oriented towards Europe, which is far and away a dry land sphere. You're asking a very complicated question. No, seriously, because there is an arms race in the Pacific. The Chinese, it's not just Navy, it's naval forces, like hypersonic missiles, it's Marines, it's fighter jets, which all operate in the maritime sphere. And so there are debates in Washington over who is gaining the upper hand in the case of an eventual conflict. In a number of the war games, which are periodically held by the Pentagon and by think tanks, China wins. And also the U.S. Navy is being threatened by ships being decommissioned without enough new ones coming on board. So it's a very complex and very expensive proposition, because the average new destroyer or submarine is $5 billion a piece. And an aircraft carrier with all the fighter jets on it, $18 to $20 billion. So we're talking about a lot of money. And this is related to the strength or weakness of the American economy as we go forward. But think of the Navy. The U.S. Navy is America's greatest strategic instrument, because its nuclear weapons cannot be used. I mean, they accumulate nuclear weapons, but they cannot be used in a practical sense. So what can be used is the Navy. Essentially. The Navy can be everywhere without a public debate about it. You send 30,000 Army troops to some country, it's on the front page of the New York Times, and there's a debate over it. So you've asked the right question. I don't know exactly the answer, how we're doing,
Okay, yes.
My question, hello, my name is Duarte, is regarding the rest of the world and how we deal with them in regards to the changing world order. You talked briefly about the South Asian countries and the democracy versus autocracy, And those countries don't want to specifically be put in a position to pick sides, kind of a Cold War mentality. So what's your idea to deal with the non-aligned countries and the rest of the world?
Yeah, I think the Global South has a big role to play, because so far the Global South has not come onto the side of the United States in this. It's hedging its bets, so to speak. India, Brazil, South Africa, other prominent players in the Global South. And to say nothing of the tiger economies of Southeast Asia like Vietnam. I think that that these countries are more likely to be influenced by an appeal to basic world order and norms than they are to getting lectures about democracy. After all, the countries I just named are mostly democracies already. They may not function as well as in Europe, but they're democracies. But they still have national interests. And, and because of the global system, the Ukraine war can affect grain deliveries in Egypt in many places, which affect the prices of basic foodstuffs, which affect the stability of the regime in question, So I think it's a matter of recognizing the strategic interests of these individual countries and not lecturing them about about perfecting their system of governance.
Thank you very much. Philippe Pat-Edouard from Nova School of Law. A simple question. Don't you think that probably the reason why we were so surprised by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, US Intel was not surprised, but the mortals, they were surprised by that, was basically because Putin exceeded what we can call a sort of strategic rationality. I mean, from the Western perspective, we tend to analyze strategic as sort of a rational option, where we tend to balance costs and benefits. But looking at what happened, it seems that Putin exceeded that rationality, having in mind as an objective questions such as identity, teleological reasons, non-rational reasons. So the better way to understand what Putin did is rather read Tolstoy or Gogol rather than read Clausewitz, for instance. So what do you think about that?
I completely agree, with that assessment. That from a Western rational perspective, Putin was in his strongest position vis-a-vis the West before he invaded Ukraine. Simply by building up forces close to Ukraine, he was then in a position to split Germany from the alliance and do various things. To actually invade was not a rational decision from the point of view of the West, because after all, the elite, the Russian elite, the oligarchs, were against the invasion and were predicting that he would not invade. They actually predicted that, no, there's not going to be, of course not, there's not going to be an invasion. And it's as you said, it's Tolstoy, it's Gogol, it's Dostoevsky, really, which comes close to kind of approximating Putin's mindset at the time.
Right here. Okay.
My name is Shukriya Bayar. Thank you very much for the presentation. I have two questions, one on Russia, the other one's on Middle East. You emphasize a lot the word geography and how important role it plays within the new, in the world order or the relationship between countries and their destiny. Russia has been there, is there, and will be there. So what is your scenario for the day after on the West's dealing with Russia? I think this has to be talked about here and there.
Right.
And
let me answer that first, then the second part. Did this? Wait a minute. Yes. The decision to indict Putin at the International Criminal Court in The Hague was a very interesting decision and gets to your question, because it sort of assumed that there would be a post-Putin Russia relatively soon, and that it would be benign. It would be better than, better than the current leadership. Those are big assumptions to make, You know, Putin could stay in power for some time, and what follows him might conceivably be worse. You may have semi-chaos in a country has enough nuclear weapons to destroy the United States in 30 minutes. And where we might not know what's going on to a much greater extent than at least now we know what's going on. So in other words, a dictator provides an opportunity for intelligence services because there's only one phone number they have to watch, one email address, or not one, I'm exaggerating, but say 50, But once you have a diverse leadership, or you have people jockeying for power, who do you follow? Who do you listen to? So I think, keep another thing in mind, that China is a much more strongly institutionalized system than Russia. China has a senior leadership, it has a central committee. If Xi Jinping were to get sick or incapacitated or something, China has a bureaucratic mechanism for replacing him to a much greater degree than Russia has. So I think the future of Russia is a black box because Putin has amassed more power than any Russian leader since Stalin. Because Brezhnev, Kosygin, Andropov, Gorbachev, they operated as more or less the first among equals in a group of about a dozen men, and they were the spokesman for them. So that nobody could get too out front the way Putin got out front with this invasion of Ukraine. So I think we're really looking at a black box as to what replaces Putin and how long he stays in power.
Thank you. And on Middle East, we see that Middle East is reshaping with new dynamics, newly defined types of strategic alliances. We are always talking about the new world order, new shaping, and the cards are redistributed in different form again. How do you see Middle East's role in this newly shaping world order?
The Middle East will be more organically connected to Eurasia, to Russia, to Europe. I think temporarily there seems to be a reduction in tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And the Biden administration is working very hard to normalize relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And so I think that the Middle East is not more unstable than it was a few years ago. It may even be more stable than it was. Erdogan in Turkey, having won re-election, can now afford to be more of a pragmatist. He doesn't have to cater to his populist base, which he needed to do to win re-election in the first place. So we might get more rational decision-making out of Ankara than we had before.
Thank you. My name is Fernando Cardoso, and I'm a fan of Agatha Christie. That's why I used to look at geopolitics. Who is winning? Where's the opportunity and things like that. So my point is that the way I tend to look at what's happening now is that China lost a lot with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia because his approaching of the Atlantic was going on and all Central European countries, mostly Germany, but also the other European countries were happy with that and the US was not. So the big loser is China and Germany. Direct losers, of course, besides Russia and Ukraine itself. So my point and my question is, I don't know whether I'm right or wrong, but the question is the following. Don't you think that China is the best power to set a deal of the conflict?
China cannot do it alone, because it's the United States that's supplying tens of billions of dollars to Ukraine. It would have to be China in some sort of coordination with the United States to do this. China can pressure Russia, but the United States can pressure Ukraine more. Zelensky had useful negotiations with Xi Jinping, but they were more polite than they were substantive. So I think China trying to broker a deal is a positive step, you know, but I think it will need more than China. China cannot do this on its own.
Right here at the front, then Mr. Redmond, then we'll have to go to the back, and then we go to the Carlucci School, of course.
Thank you. As I remember reading your book a few years ago, you were predicting not only that Russia would become a much weaker power, but it might actually sort of fall apart. And I think you were giving Poland a big boost, and Turkey. Now, given the developments with the Ukrainian war, could one say that this was Putin's kind of desperate effort to make Russia a bigger power again? And how do you see this prediction that you made that Russia might actually sort of disintegrate? Yeah, no, what I wrote was that at some point in the future, Russia could become a low-calorie version of the former Yugoslavia. You know, that was the term that I used, because Russia has no center, you know, after Putin. And I think the war in Ukraine could speed that process up. Turkey has more quantities of water than almost any country in the world. It controls the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates River. Turkey is a water power in the mid and late 21st century, which will be more important than oil, ultimately. And Poland has a national consensus to spend a lot more on its military, which, you know, and the Ukraine war has strengthened this consensus in Poland. So I think Poland is a major country to watch. It's had a very tragic history and almost disappeared on the map in the 19th century. And that has given Poland a much greater sense of nationalism than before. So I think Poland and Turkey are up-and-coming powers as we get towards the middle of the century.
Mr. Redmond.
So speaking about up-and-coming powers, Dennis Redmond, when you talk about Russia, are you talking about Russia one day becoming like an Iran with a gas station with nuclear weapons, or a small vassal of China? And two other countries, one, Saudi Arabia, which is managing a sort of moving back into the mainstream of nations and being talked to, despite some of the methods it used, and India. So are those countries going to make an impact? Are they going to be repositioned in a place where they'll make an impact?
Yes, remember, Russia has fallen apart several times in its history, but has always reconstituted itself as a great empire. So if Russia disintegrates, there will always be a Russia. There will always be Russian nationalism, and therefore we shouldn't make the mistake of punishing Russia in the way that the Western Allies punished Germany after World War I, because that would only seed the ground for more historical problems going forward. I think that India has the strength of population, but India is not as institutionally dynamic as China. It's much weaker than that. India is in the process of going from an ecumenical power to being a Hindu nationalist power. Though I have to say Modi has made some real progress in streamlining the bureaucracy by employing digitalization of the tax code and all of that. India is less of a bureaucratic nightmare than it used to be. 10 years ago, it is making progress in that regard. So I think India has demographic power, which it can actuate if it can get its bureaucracy increasingly, efficient, and thus to get things done, not just to make pronouncements, but to get things done. Russia will never go away. As weak as it is, it can always come back. Saudi Arabia, yes. I was in Saudi Arabia last year. And Saudi Arabia is a very impressive country when you're there, and not just because of oil wealth, because they managed the coronavirus emergency very well. Everyone had vaccination stamps on their iPhone, through an app, and you couldn't go into a shopping mall or a restaurant or a movie theater without showing the app. And people were very satisfied with how the government had managed things. Saudi Arabia, it's very repressive on a political sense, but actually people have more and more personal freedoms than they ever had. Women can drive, go around, do everything now, which they never used to even 5 years ago. People criticize the government all the time in Saudi Arabia, on Twitter, on social media, except they don't criticize the leader. See, that's forbidden. You cannot criticize the system or the leadership. But you can criticize all you want, the effectiveness, the efficiency of government, or the lack thereof. So Saudi Arabia is working in the direction of more personal freedoms.
Let's go back to the back row.
Good afternoon, Mr. Kaplan. Thank you for your presentation. Always a pleasure to hear you. My name is Javier. My question is from a region nobody spoke yet here, about Africa. How do you foresee the role of the African countries in the new world order? We will see a demographic pressure for Europe, of course, but we'll continue to see Africa as a resource base for countries such as China or other southern European countries, or you foresee some development in those areas? Thank you very much.
Yeah, Africa, because it's so big, is a mixed picture. You have developing economies with new middle classes in some places. You have failed or semi-failed states in other places. It will be a mixture. It will have good news and bad news stories. Demographically, even as the birth rate in Africa is declining, it will still be much higher than that in indigenous Europe through the end of this century, which will present migration pressures on Europe. Keep in mind, it isn't just people from failed states who migrate, it's new middle classes. New middle classes migrate more than anyone else. And this is a point made in Sam Huntington's book, Political Order and Changing Societies, that once a first, second generation of middle class suddenly has the money to leave, to go to a place that's even better, that's even more efficient or better run. So I think the path of migration will be south to north through the course of the 20th century. And China has built infrastructure in Africa. The U.S. has come with its militaries and providing lectures on democracy. People don't keep in mind enough that even the new democracies in Africa are often run by former military leaders. And they don't much like hearing these lectures from the Americans. The Chinese build railways, they build roads. Yes, their aid is overbearing, and it's criticized by a lot of Africans, but it's still something is being built. Something is getting done. I forget the exact statistics, but the percentage of the world population that will be African is going to increase very dramatically through the course of the 21st century, so that Africa will be completely integrated. Also, for centuries, a place like West Africa was geographically divorced from the West because of trade routes, because of lack of good harbors, lack of good deep water harbors, etc. Those problems are being eroded
by technology. So I think Africa will be crucial in the 21st century, but not in any one particular direction.
Okay. So we're going to the middle of the room, Enrique Burnet, then we'll go back to the back row, and then the Carlucci School will ask a question. Okay.
Thank you, Enrique Burnet. A follow-up question on Fernando's question about comment about China. If China was really the losing side of this war, wouldn't China be doing more to stop Russia's invasion? Or is it the other way around, and China doesn't mind what's going on, or China doesn't have that much influence in Russia?
Yeah, I wish I knew the answers to those questions. I'm not an eavesdropper on the conversations between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. I'm sure that when Xi and Putin met, Xi must have asked him very bluntly, where is this thing going? You know? What happens if the Ukrainian offensive is successful? What are you going to do then? You know, I'm sure he wanted some hard answers from Putin on this. Certainly, the weaker Russia gets, the more that China has influence over Russia. But I don't think China wants Russia to be completely humiliated, because that would reflect badly on China's alliance with Russia. I think China is basically assuming that the Russians got involved in a war that they were not prepared for, but at the same time, China must officially support them.
The Carlucci School will ask a question. I think it's the Carlucci School, right? Good.
Hi. So you've mentioned the idea of if Russia loses the Ukraine war, that they'll fall apart. And forgive me if I'm misrepresenting your argument, but you've also framed this in a positive light. Well, wouldn't there still be all these weapons of mass destruction present in the Russian area? And these potential governments that succeed Putin's government could, like you said, also be worse. So wouldn't this cause like more tension, I guess?
Yeah, no. I said that if the Ukraine war goes really badly, it could set into motion a series of events that lead to the weakening of Russia. But I don't see that as a good outcome necessarily because of the points that you made. You know, Russia still has so many nuclear weapons, and the decision-making on those weapons could fall into the hands of people who are less rational than Putin, less organized than Putin, you know, less amenable to, you know, to advice from China and others. I think at the moment, one of the things that the Chinese have done is made it clear to the Russians that you cannot use nuclear weapons. You know, at that point, China's support dissipates.
Right here at the front, and then we will go.
Hello, thank you for your analysis. My name is Timothy. I come from Italy. And, I wanted to tell you that, as you said, right-wing Italy, thank God, is against Russia. But I think that's also a question of luck. Because, you know, the right-wing coalition in Italy is made of like 3 main parties. The biggest one is the one of Giorgia Meloni. But then there are the ones of Matteo Salvini and the ones of Silvio Berlusconi, who passed away recently. But they are very close to Russia, and Silvio Berlusconi was also one of Putin's closest friends. So thank God that Giorgia Meloni got more votes. My question is that, in Italy there is a big debate about Russia, whether we should keep sending weapons to Ukraine or not. And some people, politicians, but also journalists, keep repeating that one of the main reasons for Putin's hostility towards the Western world is the fact of NATO's expansion during many years. And also the Pope, for instance, a few months ago said that the NATO has been barking at Russians' doors for years. I wanted to know your opinion on this, if this is just a false belief or if there is some truth in these thoughts.
Well, people argue against NATO expansion, and they continue to do so, that it was a bad decision. I disagree. I think NATO expansion was necessitated by the dramatic and one-sided way in which the Cold War ended. because it ended so decisively, quickly, and dramatically. It was obvious that NATO was going to naturally expand into what used to be Central Europe, like Poland and and Czechoslovakia and what was then Czechoslovakia and countries. So I think NATO expansion was written into the end of the Cold War. I also think Europe would be much more unstable today and weaker had NATO not expanded, because NATO expansion led the way to EU expansion. And EU expansion has changed not just the cities, but the countryside of Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, the eastern part of Germany, certainly Romania, less so Bulgaria. And as I said earlier, had NATO not expanded, we would have instability in the heart of Europe. And Putin, given his mindset, would be fighting for Poland rather than for Ukraine. I think NATO expansion was necessary and it was natural, given the way that the Cold War ended, and that Ukraine is sort of the part that never got into NATO, and that's what's driven this current conflict.
We'll go back to the back. I can't see over the horizon, but...
Mr. Kaplan, thank you so much. I'm a realist now because I've read your books over the last 25 years, so I appreciate that. My question is a simple one. Do you believe that the US dollar will lose the strategic currency status in the future? And if yes, what will be the succession currency?
All right, I'm not an economist, but I think the reason why the US dollar remains the world's reserve currency is because there's less risk in investing in the US than there is even in Europe, or certainly in China, or other places. And as long as the US seems less risky than those other places, the US dollar will stay on top. Being a reserve currency is not only about economics, it's about politics as well.
Right here, and then...
Hi, I'm Tumechi Bairo. Thank you both for this very dynamic conversation, very well run. Thank you, Miguel. You very rightly call our attention to geography. But geography is changing in ways that we can now make out. Do you think this is feeding back? So the cascading events of Arctic melt, rising seawater, climate refugees, is this feeding into strategic thinking on the part of decision makers and then public opinion and analysts?
It is, but not enough. I mean, for instance, Russia has been landlocked throughout its northern coast because it's been ice blocked for many months of the year. If that is changing, that's going to benefit Russia. With shipping routes going across the Arctic, that's going to shorten the distance between Europe and Asia, and that will have an effect on strategy and many other things. In general, climate change will benefit the colder countries and be devastating for the warmer countries. So geography is changing.
Well, we will finish on time, so we have time for 1-2 last questions, please. On the back.
Good afternoon, Professor. My name is Tomás Caldeira. I'm a master's student, and my question is regarding to the Greeks that you have talked about. I want to put the Romans now on top of the table. So, do you think that there are still any lessons that we can take from the late Roman Empire that still apply today?
Well, yeah, there are several lessons. Rome was gradually weakened by migration from the north. There weren't so much invasions as just general migrations from the various tribes of what is now Central and Eastern Europe. So migration helps determine the course of history. That's one lesson. The other lesson is that Rome was weakened by its imperial adventures in North Africa and other places. And that's a lesson that the United States can take to heart, given its unfortunate experience in Iraq and in Afghanistan and in Vietnam and other places, that imperial adventures overseas that are not vital for a national interest or at least don't seem vital from the benefit of hindsight can weaken a state. So therefore, you know, a counterintuitive lesson of the Russians is now that the United States is deeply engaged in the challenges of Ukraine and Taiwan, may actually strengthen the United States, because it would force the United States, like during World War II, to concentrate on places that are undeniably important.
Well, going back to the Romans was great. So last question, right there. I can only see a hand. Oh.
Thank you both for a very interesting conversation. My question takes us to the war and to Eastern Europe. It seems to me that it's not a realistic scenario to imagine Russia relinquishing Sevastopol or Melitopol, to give two examples. And I don't know if there are Russians in the room, I would believe not. But let me say that for most Russians that I know, Odessa is as Russian as St. Petersburg. So the question is twofold. Do you think there is a realistic scenario where we can see Russia giving up Melitopol and Sevastopol? And a follow-up would be, do you think that Russia will reach a settlement with the United States relinquishing, going for Odessa? Thank you.
Yeah, Crimea is not Eastern Ukraine. Crimea holds deep historical resonance and cultural resonance for Russians going back to Catherine the Great. When you talk about Crimea and Sevastopol, you're talking about Catherine the Great, Tolstoy, all of this, which has tremendous emotional impact in Russia. I think if Putin were to lose Crimea or to have to cede part of it, could be the end of his rule, or lead to the end of his rule. You know, the Russians can accept defeat in eastern Ukraine, but Crimea is another story.
Thank you.
Well, we're bang on time. I'm afraid we have to finish. I apologize, but unless the President gives me leeway, I'm afraid we have to. Yes. Grace in favor of the President of the Foundation. Last question to the back, who has fought very hard for a spot.
Okay. Robert Kaplan, sir, Professor Monjardino.
Thank you.
It's a great honor to be addressing you. I would like to place a question on China and the global south, a question on the problems of China and the global south. Since I have to admit I essentially pre-wrote the question, which is not very creative or spontaneous, but at least reveals some kind of practicality and realism, since it's a complex issue. So the question is, even though China has been losing its economic momentum, such as you, Robert Kaplan, described a while ago, Xi Jinping essentially using Marxist-Leninism to run an economy, even though it's losing its economic momentum, the fact is that it's still steadily expanding its commercial and infrastructural influence. And with it, its often subversive presence across the Eurasian landmass and the Indo-Pacific, Africa and Latin America. Additionally, China is now putting forth to its trade partners in the global south its so-called community of common destiny as an alternative to the international rules-based order. This is, of course, going against the backdrop of China's pronounced cooperation with Russia, Iran, and every other authoritarian state around. China comes up as the rich, globally extended cousin, if you like, and at that whole level of reality. Now, they've been cooperating to fundamentally...
Excuse me, can you ask a question?
Okay, I was explaining my base premise. Okay, essentially, the idea is that these autocracies have been cooperating to essentially fundamentally change the international stage to the detriment of the West. Now, the West has, over the past year or so, been trying to revive its relations with the global South by means...
Okay. Have you asked the question?
No, the question is right here, please.
Go ahead.
The West has been doing it through vigorous diplomacy and through constructive initiatives for cooperation, such as the Biden partnership, the Biden administration's partnerships with the Global South, the EU's Global Gateway, and the G7's Global Partnership for Infrastructure and Investment. My question is,
thank you.
But do you think this kind of outreach by the West is sufficient to gradually reinvigorate its image in the Global South as being the best and most reliable international partner around, and also to effectively safeguard Global South commitment to the rules-based order? Or do you think there's any need for additional strategies and policies?
I think that that the United States, in a relative terms, cannot be as dominant in the world system going forward as it was in the decades after World War II. In the decades after World War II, the Global South was either under Western imperial rule or was just coming out of it in the decades after it. China was weakened under Mao. I think now we face a world where China is the second largest economy, where countries like India, and Brazil and South Africa are much more economically important than they were decades ago. So American influence and power is not going to be what it was. And the Global South, like every other place in the world, is going to make decisions both based on their national self-interest, as determined in many cases by politicians who are committed to the voters who elected them. So it'll be a very complex situation. It's not going to be that the U.S. can just tell the Global South what to do.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for the conversation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Vamos ter agora uma sessão de autógrafos que será lá fora. So quickly, there is a section. Mr. Robert Kaplan will be kindly signing his books outside. Thank you.
Thank you.
You were really great.
Thank you. Thank
No, I
you.
want the photo.